Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 50 of the Future of Work show. I can't even believe that now we're at episode 50 because we've had such amazing guests and speakers from all over the world come and talk to us about their ideas for what the future is going to look like. But today, because it's our 50th episode, I have a super special guest who I'm just going to bring on in a moment, Professor Pamela Hinds of Stanford. I'm just going to bring Professor Hinds on. I'm so delighted she could join us.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Good morning, Professor Hinds. I know it's early for you. So, for all those who are joining us, Professor Hinds is the Fortinet founder, chair, and professor of management science and engineering at Stanford University. She's also the co director of the Center of Work, Technology, and Organization. And Professor Hinds, I know that you're associated with the Future Forum as well.
Yes, I am.
I can't think of anyone who would be a better guest for our 50th episode, truly. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So, Professor Hinds, we're living in very interesting times, and I'm just trying to hear your perspective on it. Our own organization, Uncube, does research and as well as advisory services for a number of large and small organizations to help them think through what the future organization is going to look like. And I know, and I follow your work closely. I've read many of your articles, including the HBR article, which we'll bring up also in a moment. And I know you've spoken about the shift in expectations across the world. So I'd love to hear more from you about how these expectations have shifted, and also if you're seeing any difference between the expectations that have shifted for leaders, top leadership, as well as those who are perhaps, further down the organization.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, definitely expectations are shifting. With the pandemic, I think we're seeing a number of societal changes, one of which is, people are just not as patient with having to commute to work, being away from home, and so forth. So there's a demand for much greater levels of flexibility. And also, at least, in some areas, a craving for more work-life balance. I think the pandemic was a wake-up call for many, and there's been a reprioritization of family and things outside of work. So all of that is kind of in the mix as we're thinking about what the expectations are going to be for workers. In terms of leaders and their perspective on this, I think it varies somewhat. I mean, in kind of a stark way, you could say that employees are demanding flexibility and leaders are resisting providing as much flexibility as employees want. But I don't think it's as black and white as that. And I think that leaders are actually rightfully concerned about having too much remote and hybrid work when it doesn't serve the needs of the business in the long term, or even perhaps the employees in the long term. Leaders are rightfully concerned about collaboration, and how people are going to effectively collaborate and really build the kind of bonds that help with rapport and better collaboration. They're also concerned about people's connection to the organization. I mean, it's really important for an organization for people to feel connected, feel identified, have a culture that really resonates with employees. And that's a little bit harder to maintain when employees are not actually there in the same place. The other thing that employers are concerned about is cross-team kinds of interactions. If we think about, like, one of the refrains that I hear is, hey, this worked fine for the last 2 years. Why do I have to come back into the office? it did work fine for the last few years in terms of individual productivity. In fact, some reports say that employees were more productive when they were working from home. But the losses, I think, are in the cross-team interaction and learning, being able to kind of cross-pollinate throughout the organization and learn what others are doing, develop new skills, develop leadership skills. I mean, we've seen some articles on that where leaders are saying, I don't know how to help people move up the ranks in the organization if they don't have that kind of visibility in the organization. And then just generally onboarding. We've got new employees, and most reports suggest that new employees did not fare well during the pandemic. They just didn't have a way of getting grounded, of figuring out the context of the work, of getting to know people. So there are a lot of losses if we just set up the pandemic work, we're going to continue in that mode. So, I think that the challenge is finding that balance, where we end up, where we can provide workers with the flexibility and the work-life balance that they are craving, and also something that really works for organizations. And I don't think that either leaders or workers are being unreasonable. I think that right now we don't have a really good answer for what exactly that looks like, and I think it's going to vary depending upon the organization, the type of work, and so forth. So there's going to need to be a lot of experimentation. Trying out of new things. I know leaders are really working on this, and trying to sort things out. One of the things that Tim Cook recently said, CEO of Apple, is that the key is finding a model that takes advantages of the strengths of both in-person and virtual engagement, and the eventual model will look quite different from what we see today. And I think that's really right on target. And it's a matter of figuring that out so that everybody is happier in their work.
I so love, Professor Hinds, that you spoke about, the concerns that leaders have, and our own experience, both conducting research with organizations and, of course, in conversation with leaders, is that, on the one hand, people who are particularly early careers, say the first 15 years of their work experience, it's been pretty much en masse shift towards, craving more flexibility and work-life balance, exactly like you said. So, it's like, it's true for most people. And it doesn't mean that they want to work completely remotely. I know some of your research also says it's only 12%, 15% who want to work completely digital. So while there is that craving for connection, but there's an equally strong expectation almost at this point that when we, as the pandemic, winds down, whenever that happens, we will have a more flexible and a more workable almost organization. And at the senior level, what we see is a wide dispersion. So on the one hand, there is still a group of leaders who are very interested and keen on getting people back to the way things were pre-pandemic. And it comes from some of the concerns that you spoke about, like, what about culture? What about developing people? What about innovation? What about social capital? So the concerns are very valid, and so there is that whole pocket who's very traditional. And then there's also the pocket of, okay, this is a golden opportunity.
Right.
Let's reinvent the workplace. And I find within the leadership teams, there's a very wide spread at the moment.
Interesting.
Is that something you found as well?
That's interesting. I haven't looked at leadership teams within a particular organization and seen that spread. But certainly, leadership across the board. I mean, famously, of course, Elon Musk basically, if you don't come to work, we're going to assume that you've resigned. Very, very strong point of view. And it's interesting in that case, they're building cars. So, that is different than, say, software development, where you might not need to be in person. So the work matters as well. But, contrast that with Brian Chesney, who, published his new remote work policy that says, we're going to kind of figure this out. We're going to have regular team meetups. We're going to make sure that people are having the kind of interaction they need. But on the whole, we're going to leave it to employees to decide what works for them. So, and I should have said with Airbnb, Brian Chesney with Airbnb. Yeah. I mean, there's a wide range of points of view on that.
Yeah. So I'm going to come to your HBR article, Professor Hinds, because I can't think of anything more pertinent at this moment. One of the biggest concerns that leaders have is exactly that, how are we going to build or strengthen culture if people aren't at work enough, at least? And I'd love to hear, what do you think are the top 2 or 3 things that would work both in a hybrid or even a perhaps largely remote setting? How does one build culture in perhaps what is increasingly becoming a digital first world for at least many parts of the world?
Right. I think that's a really good question. And I don't think there is a clear answer yet. And again, with many of my responses, I'll say it kind of depends on the organization and the business and how everything is structured and the existing culture. But it's also, it's to build culture, but it's also to maintain the culture that they have. I mean, that's, I think, as new employees come in, you can dilute the culture. So how do you maintain what you have? I think all of those are of concern. One of the things that I think is going to be really important is for leaders to think more intentionally about building culture. Because, historically what we've done, cultures get built, right? There's a culture where you're located, there's a culture where I'm located. It just happens. When people are together, culture gets established. And the question for organizations is, what is the culture that's getting established? Is it consistent across the organization? I think that's a huge concern when we're talking about particularly hybrid culture, but also remote. And is it the culture that we want for this organization? So, and then, there's a lot of research on culture and how culture gets built. But a lot of that research points to things that are in the environment. It's the posters on the wall. It's, the way that people are engaging with one another, the types of offices that people have, the clothing that people wear. All of those are indicators of culture. So we have to think more broadly about, okay, well, what are the other ways that culture gets communicated that's not about, coming to the office every day, because coming to the office every day, it just sort of happens in a sense. And again, leaders can be very intentional about building the space and the norms and so forth, but then it kind of works, right? When we're talking about remote and hybrid work, and again, particularly hybrid, and I'll say more about why that is in a minute, but we have to think more about how in this kind of a format do I convey culture as a leader? How do I set up norms for the way that people interact in these kinds of technologies and when we're remote and hybrid that support the kind of culture that we want? What are the things that I need to say as a leader? How often do I need to engage the organization as a leader in order to reinforce those aspects of culture? Culture doesn't get built just by saying, hey, this is our culture, this is what we want. You need to model those behaviors. You need other people to be modeling and supporting those behaviors. So, I don't have really good answers about exactly what leaders need to be doing. And I think there's the opportunity for some creativity here, and really thinking through alternative markers of culture that are easier to sustain in this kind of virtual environment. And I mentioned that I think hybrid is particularly challenging, and that's because if you've got some people coming into the office some of the time, and they are being exposed to one another, it's reinforcing that culture. They're being exposed to all of the physical markers of culture in that environment. They are probably aligning around a particular culture, or just continuing to operate based on the culture that existed before. But those who aren't coming in, so if it's hybrid and you've got some people who are never coming in to the office, there's the risk that you end up with kind of a fragmented culture, where it's strong among some people and weak or different among others. So that's the other challenge, I think, for leaders, is to try to figure out how to ensure that the culture is communicated and reinforced with those people who are not in the office.
I'm going to come to something that you have written about, the importance of at least episodic interactions in distributed teams. Would love to hear your thoughts around how does this play into perhaps solving, exactly the challenge that you spoke about, that there might be teams in the organization which come to office far more regularly than others. And then there's, as you said, the additional challenge of, how do we make up for perhaps almost the huge difference in the richness of signals you're getting, when you're in office versus remotely. So what might be some ways out that you have found in your own studies of geographically distributed teams that, any leader would do well to think through?
Yeah. So we do have that study out where we looked at the role of site visits, and what happened when we were studying these teams that were split between Germany and India and the US, or the US and Germany. And what we found was that in all cases, when there were site visits, where one group from one location went to the other location and spent time. So it wasn't just a day-long visit where they spent time in meeting rooms, but they actually were there for multiple days. They worked side by side in office space and really learned more about their colleagues and the context in which they were working. I think that's instructive for hybrid work, because what it suggests is that it really helps to bring people together and give them the opportunity to engage and work side by side, and get to know one another better, build rapport, figure out how to communicate more effectively together. It made a big difference in the study that we did. One of the things that we noticed was that after site visits, people were much more responsive on email. People were much more willing to bring up issues or problems, in part because they weren't afraid that things would go haywire, because they didn't know how somebody might respond. Once they got to know people, they were like, oh no, I can say that to Shalini and she'll be fine. So I think all of those things still really matter, and can be used in hybrid work. And one of the strategies that fully remote organizations use is to bring, particularly for the smaller organizations, to bring the whole organization together periodically throughout the year, and have meetings and work together and so forth, in order to establish and reinforce those ties. So I absolutely think that that's something that organizations that are moving to hybrid can think through. There was I'm trying to remember who actually talked about it. I'll have to look it up. But anyway, one of the things that Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, has said is that their policy is that they are going to meet up regularly for team gatherings, and they expect that most employees will connect in person every quarter for about a week at a time, some more frequently. So I think that's sort of moving toward this plan to.
I actually found that study very insightful because it compared offsites with office visits, and
Right.
this has been almost the season of offsites for all the right reasons. People
Right.
are sort of coming together physically. Many leadership teams are coming together in person after a long time, and offsites are extremely useful for their annual planning, thinking through, etc. But what I found really interesting was your observation or your finding in this study that more than offsites, it's visiting and working on site.
That's right.
That's
right.
In helping people understand each other, and therefore building the kind of understanding that enables work over a period of time. So I found that very, very helpful.
It's interesting though, when we think about hybrid work or remote work, there isn't a site to go to, right? We're not going to come into my office here at home, right? So that provides another challenge, I think, for leaders. But I think part of some of that can be accomplished in other ways, where we sort of intentionally communicate more effectively about the context in which we're working. We ask more questions of one another about the context within which we're working. And it also has a lot to do with how you structure that in-person time. We have to be very intentional, and I can't remember who said it, but there was the term thrown out about intentional connecting, really using in-person time in a very thoughtful way. And you might remember in the study that we published, not all the teams that had face-to-face visits did better. There were a couple of teams that actually did worse after face-to-face meetings, and it was because it was structured really poorly and it reinforced the separation, the difference, and so forth. So how those meetings are structured matters a lot.
You raise such an important point, and I know it's one that many organizations are struggling with at this point, that how do you do in-office days or in-person days? How do you set them up? And I know a lot of organizations right at the start of hybrid had, they did the whole welcome back, let's do celebrations for a couple of weeks. And I think that's great. But then very naturally, leaders say, okay, now what? What? Are we expected to do that forever? So, and it's a very valid question.
Yeah.
So, what advice would you give leaders on how to design in-person days, more for the long term? What should be different?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing I would say is experimentation, because there isn't a right answer. We just don't know yet, but there are a lot of different things that we can be smart about trying out. One of the quotes I love from Tim Cook, Apple CEO, is, "We are now running the mother of all experiments," and I think that's absolutely true. We are trying to figure it out, but how we structure that in-person time, how often people get together, whether or not you have anchor days where everybody comes in, which, by the way, I generally think is a good idea. Depends a lot on the work, on the team. It may change based on where you are in a project cycle, for example. So the cadence, I think, has to be figured out by different organizations and by different teams, based on a whole variety of things that mean that they have different needs, in terms of the work and the need to connect. In general, like I said, I think anchor days are a good idea because it provides an opportunity for everybody to come together, to have face-to-face interaction, to work side by side. And it also creates a vibrancy in the work environment. I think one of the problems right now is that our work environments are kind of empty, right? And then we're spending our days sitting on Zoom while we're in the office, which is a little dreary, right? So, I think that really, that intentional connecting, making sure that when people are in the office, there are things going on. They're not spending their days on Zoom. They are in face-to-face meetings. There are social gatherings. There are presentations and other kinds of opportunities that make that time really valuable. So I think that's a really key piece of the puzzle.
You're absolutely right, Professor Hinds. In fact, over the last maybe 4 months or so, we've been interviewing so many senior leaders to understand, okay, what would you like to do? If you could design your team work arrangement any which way you like, what would you like it to be? And of course, there is, as I said, many who would like it to go back to what it was. But they also tend to be people who are leading teams with very day-to-day operational roles where I can sort of understand their point of view as well, that, it's easier. It's easier. It's hard to make that happen anymore because employee expectations have shifted, but I can understand leaders' desire, shall I say. And then from there, the very popular 2 or 3 days in office, fixed days. But the challenge in the last few months as people have started experimenting with that form of hybrid is exactly this, that unless you have, your team or most people in your team in office, the office is empty, your cafeteria is not really working, it doesn't have the vibrancy, and you're doing work, just the way you would at home. And so people are asking, why am I commuting for a couple of hours if I have to spend my day? And it's it's a reasonable question, right?
Absolutely.
And then there are others who have spoken about, maybe one way to get over this challenge is just to have a cadence of, every, I don't know, could be anything, but say 1 week a month, we're all in office those 5 days. And, we're going to use that time very differently because everybody's there, and it's just a lot easier to do, right? 1 week a month rather than every single week thinking of how to intentionally set up.
I don't know. I mean, again, I think it's going to vary depending upon the work. The advantage of, say, every Tuesday, everybody is there, is you can have, standing meetings on Tuesdays. You can sort of schedule everything that's going to happen on Tuesdays. If you're doing it once a month, then there's a lot that
you're right.
People's regular work isn't happening. But it depends. I think it depends on the team. There may be some teams where it's more useful for them to do this heads down work at home for 3 weeks or however long, and then get together and pull it all together and brainstorm and particularly with creative work, that actually may be a better solution than the 1 day a week.
I think 1 day a week, if most of the team comes, is a great possibility to explore, because then you don't have this challenge of, we actually have an empty office and we're doing exactly what we did at home. So if we have a lot of people in, the majority of people in, I think that is definitely a great opportunity. So Professor Hinds, just based on what you said, the fact that it depends on the work, it depends perhaps on how distributed the team itself is, how likely or how realistic is it even that they're going to, come together very often. Do you think as we move ahead, we're going to see within an organization several different kinds of work arrangements side by side? Do you think that's what the future looks like?
So I have two answers to that. One is I actually think it's a good goal to have that kind of tailored experience based on the work and the employees and how far away they are and the leadership and their capabilities and all of that. I don't know whether or not organizations are going to have an appetite for that, because it's harder to manage if, you know, one team is operating based on a certain policy or structure, and the team across the way has a different policy or structure. And, you know, we'll have to kind of see, and maybe, you know, with some organizations, like I know Genentech has been doing this for years, they have team agreements. And, you know, maybe you develop a team agreement, and if each team develops a different team agreement that is approved by their leaders, then it doesn't feel inequitable to do that. But I actually do think that having that kind of more tailored experience is likely to make sense. And it might not vary, you know, with teams that are really adjacent doing very similar work. It might be in different parts of the organization where some are doing design and some are doing building and some are in finance and so forth. It may be more based on the functions that people are performing. But I worry that there is no one size fits all, that, you know, the practices that work for one might be suboptimal for others. So yeah, I do think that it's important.
A couple of months ago, I had interviewed two future of work heads of two very large global banks, not Indian at all. And I asked them what their thoughts were. And it was interesting because what they shared was that where they're headed is exactly this. Different divisions of the bank will have different work arrangements. And that depends on the remote potentials, security challenges, how distributed the team is. And so within one premise, so say their London office, different teams will have a different design of their workspace because they have elected for, you know, a different format of, you know, how often are they going to meet, how often are they going to work from office, etc., etc. So I think that's really interesting. But of course, it opens up a whole set of new challenges for organizational leaders, because I don't think we've ever seen anything like this before, right?
No, I mean, certainly there has been more remote work. People have been telecommuting or working from home periodically in certain professions. You know, again, software development, that's one that's relatively portable. People have been able to do that for a while, as compared to, you know, people who are, you know, mechanical engineers who are working on things in the shop. So we've had it, but nowhere near at the scale that we're talking about. And you mentioned some of the challenges. One of the things I've been thinking about as we've been talking is the real estate challenge. So let's say that I decide that, you know, my team only needs to come in, you know, 1 day a week or 2 days a week or 5 days a month or whatever it is. Does that mean that that space that we occupy sits empty the rest of the time? If not, I mean, that probably doesn't make sense, particularly in very urban environments, very expensive environments in which companies are operating. So then the alternative perhaps is more hoteling, right? So you say, okay, well, you know, team A will use that space on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and team B will use that space on Mondays and Fridays, and so forth. But then there's even less connection to the work environment than if you have, you know, your family photos on the desk and have more of a sense that this is my space and this is my team space. So it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of gets worked out. Because again, I think it's unrealistic and probably wasteful to just hold that space empty. But on the other hand, it's not clear to me how to structure that space so that it is inviting, it feels like home, where people really want to come and work together. And the other issue with that too is, one of the things I talk a lot about is the cross-team interaction. So, almost all of the discussions that I'm hearing and the discussion even that we're having here is optimizing for the team, right? But what about connecting with all of those others in the organization? And how do we make sure that there's this pollination that happens across teams? And maybe when we think about real estate and different teams coming in different days, we also think about, well, what are the different teams that we would want proximate to each other now that maybe before we couldn't be proximate because the organization was so large and spread out. But maybe it's an opportunity to enliven the work environment by having that kind of intentional connecting.
It's a fascinating idea, Professor Hinds, and I mean, if you've seen an example where it works, I would love to hear, because it comes up in even when we're speaking to leaders about designing, the form of the future workplace, hybrid, whatever. Yeah. That you're absolutely right. We tend to optimize for the team, and the team could be large, it could be small, it depends. Yeah. But part of the loss of, or part of the challenge in all of this is, what about cross-team connections, right? As well. So, Professor Hinds, with that, we come towards the end of our conversation today. But before we go, I'd love to hear from you 2 or 3 ideas that you would like any leader who's thinking through, what future arrangements would make sense, could take away and apply in, some of their own exploration or thinking around this.
Oh, goodness. So, I mean, as we've been talking, we've talked about some of them. I do think that some sort of team agreements are really useful because it distributes the decision-making down to the team, and you get a much greater level of commitment, and the team is then working together to balance out the interests of various members of the committee, rather than, everyone being told that there's going to be a particular policy. So I think that, I know organizations are experimenting with that right now, and I think that's potentially very powerful. I guess what I would like to see, though, is those team agreements also having some kind of connection to other teams within the organization. So it's not being done in isolation, but maybe having input into team agreements by other teams that there's some kind of interdependence or interconnection with. So I think that would be helpful for development, for learning, for stronger connection to the organization, and so forth. So that's one of the things I would say. The other thing I would say, and you've mentioned a couple times that some leaders are really preferring to continue doing things the way that we used to. I think one of the real challenges here is that we have to learn how to lead differently than we used to, right? So we have all grown, I know I have grown up on with the expectation that I can actually, peek over a cubicle wall and see what people are working on. There's a kind of an implicit monitoring that has always taken place. And when people are not there, there's this uncertainty about, what it is they're working on. Are they really working hard? And all of that. And we need to replace that approach to leadership with something new. And I don't think we're there yet. At least in the US, we've never been particularly great at training new leaders to be effective. I think leadership training is going to be far more important in this new environment, particularly during this transition period, than it has ever been before, because we can't rely on sort of our natural ways of doing things. So I think that will be interesting to kind of rethink what leadership looks like and train people to be effective in remote and hybrid leadership.
Thank you, Professor Hinds. You've really hit the nail on its head. The fact that, perhaps we have more questions than answers for, even when it comes to what does effective leadership look like in, a hybrid or digital first world, because we know it's different and we know it's going to need, some things perhaps we can say with some surety that, it needs more trust, it needs more empowerment, it needs more, as you spoke about a little while earlier, develop intentionality in all that you do. What would have happened naturally without perhaps you're giving much thought to, now you have to be much more conscious and much more thoughtful around what are you communicating, is it landing, is it not landing, what needs to shift. And I know you've spoken about this in many of your articles as well. So it's this whole new game that is perhaps just beginning to emerge. So even if organizations wish to train, as yet, I'm not sure how many know what to train people to do. It's not in the execution that the challenge is, it is in the ideas that will sort of power through that training. And, I think that's just beginning to come together, that, okay, what does it look like? What does good leadership even look like at this moment?
Yeah. There's actually one of the places I think you're 100% right. I mean, I think we have to rebuild it, right? But one of the places that we can go to look for that are leaders of fully remote organizations. They've been doing this for a while, very, very effectively. And there's just a little bit of research. Jen Reimer, Rhymer, did her dissertation looking at this. So there's some things that we can learn from what these fully remote leaders are doing. And that includes being really transparent about plans and decisions and all of that, so that everybody can stay on the same page. Also, leaders of global teams have been doing this for quite a while. And there are a lot of people out there who have been leading global teams and have figured out how to ensure that even though you're spread across 2, 3, 5 different sites, the teams are able to come together and stay coordinated and feel connected. So, there are indicators of things that we can be doing as leaders to be more effective.
Thank you, Professor Hinds. Thank you so much. I will take those details from you, and I'm going to post them as well for all those who joined us and want to take a look at other research that Professor Hinds has referred to. I'm going to post that. And I will, of course, be posting some of Professor Hinds' work as well. For anyone who's interested, do take a look. I think it's super insightful and super helpful for anyone who's trying to think through some of the key principles for designing the future workplace. So with that, we come to an end of our conversation. I hope you really enjoyed it, and do stay with us for future episodes of the Future of Work show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been fun. Great question.